The summer of 1911 brought a heat unlike any Thomas Williams had known in his 38 years working Iowa soil. Standing on his porch, he wiped sweat from his brow and surveyed the cornfields that stretched across his 20 acres. The stalks stood tall and green despite the drought that had claimed several neighboring farms. Beyond the fields lay the old tool shed, a weathered structure his father had built when they first settled this land in 1883. Pa! His eldest son, James, 16 and broad-shouldered from farm labor, approached from the barn. "Hogs are fed. Anything else before supper?" Thomas shook his head. "We're done for today." He didn't mention the tool shed, though it had occupied his thoughts all week. Since his father's passing 3 months prior, Thomas had inherited the farm, along with its secrets. His father had been peculiar about that shed, keeping it locked and forbidding the children from entering. The screen door creaked as Margaret, Thomas's wife of 18 years, called them in for supper. Inside, the Williams family gathered around the oak table that dominated their modest kitchen. Besides James, there were the twins Emma and Elizabeth, 14 and constantly whispering to each other, and young William, only 10 and perpetually curious. "Reverend Porter stopped by while you were in the fields," Margaret said as she ladled stew into earthenware bowls. "He's concerned about old man Jenkins. Says he's been raving about something watching him from the woods," Thomas grunted. Jenkins's farm bordered theirs to the east, and the old man had grown increasingly erratic since his wife passed last winter. "Did you unlock Grandpa's shed yet?" William asked suddenly, looking up at his father with eager eyes. The table fell silent. Even the twins stopped their whispering. "That's not for discussion at the table," Thomas replied, his voice firm. He caught Margaret's questioning glance, but avoided her eyes. He hadn't told her about the letter his father had left, instructing that the shed be opened exactly 3 months after his death. Today marked that day. After supper, when the children had gone to bed, Thomas sat in his father's old rocking chair by the hearth. Margaret settled beside him, her knitting needles clicking softly. "You're going to that shed tonight, aren't you?" she asked without looking up. Thomas stared into the dying embers. "Pa left instructions, said I needed to check on something." Margaret's needles paused. He was different after that winter of 1893, the same winter his livestock started dying mysteriously. She hesitated. "Do you remember what he used to say? Some things feed on more than grain." Thomas remembered. That bitter winter had claimed half their cattle and most of their hogs. His father had blamed it on something he'd found in the fields, something he'd locked away in the tool shed. The same night he'd hung strange charms of twisted iron above every door and window of the house. "It's probably just tools and old harnesses," Thomas said, more to reassure himself than his wife. But as he rose and took the oil lamp from the mantel, they both knew it was more than that. Outside, darkness had claimed the farm. The moon hung thin and sharp in the sky, casting weak silver light across the fields. Thomas's boots crunched on the dry earth as he made his way toward the shed. Behind him, the farmhouse windows glowed amber, a beacon of warmth and safety he was leaving behind. The shed loomed larger as he approached, its weathered boards silver-grey in the moonlight. The padlock that had secured it for years hung open, just as his father's letter had promised it would be. "When the time comes, the lock will open for you," his father had written, though Thomas had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man. Yet here was the lock, open as promised. With a deep breath, Thomas lifted the latch and pulled the door open. The hinges groaned, unused for years. He raised his lamp, pushing back the darkness. The interior was surprisingly clean. Tools hung in neat rows along one wall. Scythes, hammers, augers, and implements Thomas couldn't name. His father's workbench stood against the far wall, its surface clear except for a leather-bound journal and a strange contraption of brass and glass that gleamed in the lamplight. Thomas approached cautiously. The journal was worn, its pages yellowed with age. A faded photograph marked a page near the center. Thomas opened it to find his father's handwriting, the script cramped and urgent. May 15th, 1893. It came with the thaw. I found the first calf this morning, drained and cold. No blood, no wounds, just empty. Whatever is feeding on my livestock isn't natural. Jenkins saw something in his north field last night, said it moved like a man, but wasn't one. Thomas's hand trembled, causing shadows to dance wildly across the walls. He turned the page. May 22nd, 1893. I tracked it to the old burial ground beyond the creek. The settler graves had been disturbed, but not by any animal I know. I found it sleeping in the earth. It looked like a man, but when I touched it with iron, it opened its eyes. They were black, all black. The next several entries detailed his father's attempts to kill the creature, each ending in failure, until the final entry, June 14th, 1893. I cannot kill it, but I've found a way to bind it. The old woman from the Bohemian settlement gave me what I needed. Glass to trap its reflection, brass to channel the binding, and blood, my blood, to seal it. It fights the binding, growing stronger when the seasons change. I must check it with each solstice and equinox. If the binding weakens, God help us all. Thomas stared at the brass and glass contraption on the workbench. It resembled a lantern, but with mirrors arranged inside its chamber. A dark substance had dried along its seams. Blood, his father's blood. With shaking hands, he lifted the photograph that had marked the page. It showed his father standing with another man in front of the shed. The stranger's face was blurred, as though he'd moved at the exact moment the photograph was taken. A scraping sound came from behind him. Thomas whirled around, raising the lamp. Something moved in the corner of the shed, where the light didn't quite reach. Not a rat or a raccoon. This movement was deliberate, almost human. "Who's there?" Thomas called, his voice steadier than he felt. The scraping stopped. Then came a voice dry as autumn leaves. "Has it been so long already, young Williams?" A figure stepped into the lamplight. It had the shape of a man, tall and gaunt, wearing clothes of an old style, dirt-stained and torn. But its face, Thomas recoiled. Its face was wrong somehow, the features too sharp, the eyes too dark, the skin pallid and waxy, like a corpse left too long in water. "Your father made a promise," the figure said, taking another step forward, a binding sealed in blood. "But he's gone now, isn't he? And you—" It tilted its head, studying Thomas like a curious insect. "You don't even know what I am." Thomas backed toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure followed, its movements fluid, yet somehow wrong, as if its joints bent in ways a human's shouldn't. "Stay back," Thomas warned, holding the lamp before him like a shield. The figure smiled, revealing teeth too numerous and sharp for a human mouth. "Your father knew the old ways. He knew how to bind me." It gestured to the brass and glass contraption. "But you, what do you know of such things, farmer? What do you know of hunger that spans centuries?" Thomas's back hit the door. His hand fumbled for the latch, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in his throat as the creature stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the grave dirt on its clothes, the ancient corruption of its flesh. "Your father fed me," it whispered. "Livestock, mostly. Occasionally a drifter no one would miss, but I've been so hungry these past months." The lamp in Thomas's hand flickered, the flame guttering as if something were pulling the air from the room. In the dimming light, the creature's form seemed to shift and change, becoming less human with each passing second. "What are you?" Thomas gasped. The creature's smile widened impossibly. "I am what waits in the spaces between your fields, farmer. I am what whispers in the corn when the wind dies. I am hunger." As it lunged forward, Thomas's world collapsed into darkness and teeth, and the terrible knowledge that his father's burden had now become his own. Dawn broke over the Williams farm with the gentle indifference of nature. Dew sparkled on cornfields, and chickens clucked in their coop, unaware of the night's events. In the farmhouse, Margaret Williams stood at the kitchen window, Anxiety etched across her face as she stared toward the tool shed where her husband had disappeared the night before. James entered the kitchen, already dressed for chores. "Pa's not in the barn," he said, concern in his young voice. "He went to the shed last night," Margaret replied, her voice tight. "He never came back to bed." Without waiting for her instruction, James strode toward the door. "I'll go check." "No!" Margaret's shout stopped him. Something in her tone made him turn. "Your grandfather had rules about that shed. We wait for your father." But as morning stretched into afternoon with no sign of Thomas, Margaret's resolve weakened. The twins reported seeing movement in the shed through their bedroom window. Young William swore he heard his father's voice calling from inside. By evening, Margaret could wait no longer. "James, fetch Reverend Porter from town," she instructed. "I'm going to the shed." "I'm coming with you," James insisted, his jaw set in the same stubborn line as his father's. Margaret knew that expression too well to argue. She nodded, tucking a kitchen knife into her apron pocket. They walked together across the darkening farm, the sunset painting long shadows across the fields. The shed door stood ajar, a thin slice of darkness visible between weathered boards. Margaret approached cautiously, James close behind. "Thomas?" she called. "Are you in there?" A groan answered her, unmistakably her husband's voice. James pushed past her, throwing the door wide. Thomas Williams sat slumped against his father's workbench, his face haggard and drawn, a deep cut on his forearm crudely bandaged with a torn shirt sleeve. The brass and glass contraption from his father's journal glowed faintly beside him, emitting a soft humming sound. "Thomas!" Margaret rushed to him, kneeling beside her husband. "What happened? You've been gone all night and day." Thomas looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. "I had to remake the binding," he whispered hoarsely. "It nearly got free." "What nearly got free?" James demanded, looking around the shed. Nothing seemed amiss except for a dark stain on the dirt floor. Thomas shook his head wearily. "Help me back to the house. I need to explain everything." As James helped his father to his feet, Margaret noticed something on the workbench, the journal, open to pages filled with diagrams and strange symbols. She reached for it, but Thomas grabbed her wrist. "Leave it," he said. "It needs to stay here with the binding." Back at the farmhouse, after Thomas had been cleaned up and his wound properly dressed, the family gathered in the kitchen. Even the children sensed the gravity of the situation, sitting quietly as their father collected himself. "My father left me more than this farm," Thomas began, his voice steadier now. "He left me a responsibility, a burden." He looked at each of them in turn. "There's something trapped in that shed, something old and hungry that my father captured back in '93, during that terrible winter when we lost so many animals." Margaret remembered that winter all too well, the unexplained deaths of livestock, not just on their farm, but on others nearby. Old man Jenkins losing his mind after finding his prize bull dead and drained of blood, the strange marks in the snow that couldn't be identified as any known animal. "What is it, Pa?" Emma asked, her usual bravado subdued. Thomas shook his head. "My father never gave it a name. The Bohemians who settled north of here might have called it Upir or some such. Others might say vampire, though it's not like the stories." He rubbed his bandaged arm absently. "It feeds on blood, on life itself. It can look like a man when it wants to, speak like one too, but it's something else entirely. You can't expect us to believe," James began, but Thomas cut him off. "I don't care if you believe me, son, but you will obey me in this. No one goes near that shed without my permission, ever." A knock at the door interrupted them. Reverend Porter entered, his tall frame stooping slightly under the doorway. "Margaret sent for me," he explained, looking between them with concern. "Is everything all right?" Thomas hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "Reverend, what do you know of the old burial ground beyond Jenkins's Creek?" The Reverend's expression darkened. "That's no consecrated ground, Thomas. Those were settlers who came before the church was established. During the harsh winter of 1857, there were rumors of terrible things done to survive. Like what? William asked, his young face alive with curiosity despite the grim conversation. Nothing for young ears, the Reverend replied firmly. He turned back to Thomas. Why do you ask about such things now? Thomas exchanged a glance with Margaret. My father discovered something there, years ago, something he trapped in our tool shed. To everyone's surprise, Reverend Porter didn't scoff or dismiss the claim. Instead, he paled visibly. Your father spoke to me of this, near the end. I thought it was the morphine talking. He lowered himself heavily into a chair. He mentioned a binding ritual he learned from an old Bohemian woman, said it needed to be renewed with the changing seasons. The equinox is in 3 days, Thomas said quietly. The Reverend nodded gravely. And the binding grows weakest at such times. He looked around at the worried faces of the Williams family. Your father bore this burden alone for many years, Thomas. But perhaps that was a mistake. For the next 2 days, Thomas recovered his strength while instructing James and Margaret on what his father's journal revealed. The binding ritual required blood from the one who maintained it. Not much, but it had to be freely given. The brass and glass contraption, which Thomas now understood to be a soul cage of sorts, needed to be cleansed and recharged with sacred words at each solstice and equinox. On the evening before the fall equinox, Thomas gathered his family in the kitchen once more. Reverend Porter had returned, bringing with him blessed water from the church and iron nails forged by the blacksmith specifically for this purpose. I won't lie to you, Thomas told them. This is dangerous. The creature is strongest when the binding is weakest. It will try to trick us, to frighten us, to turn us against each other. We should just burn the shed down, James suggested, not for the first time. Thomas shook his head. My father tried fire. It doesn't work. The creature simply escapes and finds a new place to lair. This way we know where it is. We can control it. And if the binding fails, Margaret asked softly. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Then God help us all. As darkness fell, Thomas, James, and Reverend Porter made their way to the shed. Margaret and the younger children remained in the house, doors and windows secured with the iron charms Thomas's father had made years ago. The shed looked deceptively ordinary in the gathering gloom. Thomas unlocked the padlock and pushed the door open. Inside, the soul cage glowed faintly on the workbench, its light dimmer than before. It's weakening, Thomas murmured, stepping inside with the others close behind. The air in the shed felt different, heavier, colder, with an underlying scent of decay. Thomas moved toward the workbench, reaching for the soul cage. "Father!" came a voice from the shadows. "You've returned." Thomas froze. The voice was his son William's, yet William was safely in the house with Margaret and the twins. "It's trying to trick us," Reverend Porter whispered, clutching his Bible tightly. "Remember what you said. It will use our fears against us." From the corner stepped what appeared to be young William, but his eyes were wrong, too dark, too knowing. "Don't listen to the holy man, Father," the thing wearing William's face said. "He wants to take me away from you, just like he took grandfather away." James made a strangled sound beside Thomas. "That's not Will," he hissed. "Will's back at the house." "Are you certain?" the creature asked, now using James's own voice, though its lips didn't move. "Are you certain of anything, boy? Do you know what your father has fed me over the years?" Thomas lunged forward, grabbing the soul cage from the workbench. "Enough! Back to your binding." The creature laughed, the sound shifting from William's childish giggle to something ancient and cruel. Its form wavered, the illusion of William melting away to reveal the gaunt, pale entity Thomas had encountered before. "The old man is dead," it said, its voice now a dry rasp. "His blood no longer powers the binding, and yours is too weak, farmer, too diluted by fear." Thomas held up the soul cage, which flickered like a dying lamp. "Reverend, the words." Reverend Porter began to recite from Thomas's father's journal, strange syllables that seemed to catch in the air. The creature hissed, its form becoming less distinct, as if the words themselves were unraveling its presence. "Now, Thomas!" the Reverend shouted between verses. Thomas pulled a knife from his belt and sliced his palm, letting blood drip onto the brass fittings of the soul cage. As his blood touched metal, the cage flared with sudden light, its glass panels capturing and reflecting the illumination in complex patterns that filled the shed. The creature shrieked, a sound no human throat could produce. It lunged toward Thomas, but its movements became sluggish, as if it were moving through thick syrup. The Reverend's voice rose, the strange words coming faster now, and with each syllable, the creature's form grew more transparent. James, recovering from his shock, grabbed the iron nails they had brought and began hammering them into the four corners of the shed, just as Thomas had instructed. Each strike of metal against wood seemed to cause the creature pain, its shrieking intensifying. "You cannot hold me forever," it howled, its voice now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "The binding weakens with each generation. Your son will fail where you succeeded. Your grandchildren will forget, and I will feed again." With a final, terrible cry, the creature collapsed inward, drawn into the soul cage like smoke pulled into a bottle. The glass panels blazed brilliantly for a moment, then settled into a steady, pulsing glow. Thomas quickly closed the brass latches, sealing the contraption. Silence fell in the shed, broken only by their ragged breathing. "Is it done?" James asked, hammer still clutched in his white-knuckled grip. "For now," Thomas answered, setting the soul cage carefully back on the workbench. "Until the winter solstice, when we must renew the binding again." Reverend Porter placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Your father carried this burden alone for too long. It nearly broke him in the end." Thomas nodded, looking at his son. "I won't make the same mistake. James needs to know everything, to be prepared for when it becomes his responsibility." As they secured the shed and headed back toward the farmhouse, where Margaret and the children waited anxiously, Thomas felt the weight of generations on his shoulders. His father had protected their family, their neighbors, perhaps the entire county from the horror lurking in human form. Now that duty passed to him, and someday to James. The creature's final words echoed in his mind. "The binding weakens with each generation." Thomas glanced back at the shed, a simple wooden structure containing something ancient and malevolent. How many more bindings would hold it? How many more generations of Williamses would stand guard against the darkness? As if reading his thoughts, James spoke up. "We'll find a way to destroy it permanently, Pa, not just bind it." Thomas looked at his son, seeing the determination in the boy's eyes. Perhaps James was right. Perhaps they could end this curse once and for all. But as they approached the warm lights of the farmhouse, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the creature in the shed was patient. It had existed for centuries before his father trapped it. It could wait for centuries more for a single mistake, a single forgotten ritual, a single weakened Williams to set it free. And when that day came, it would be hungry. October brought the harvest to the Williams farm. Golden corn, standing tall and ready in orderly rows that stretched toward the horizon. Thomas Williams worked alongside his son James, their scythes swinging in rhythm as they cut through stalks. The farm hands they'd hired for the season followed behind, gathering and bundling. 3 weeks had passed since the binding ritual at the equinox. 3 weeks of uneasy peace. The tool shed remained locked, visited only by Thomas, who checked the soul cage daily, ensuring its otherworldly glow remained strong. "Another good yield this year," James remarked, as they paused to sharpen their blades. At 16, he had fully embraced his role as his father's right hand, and now as keeper of a darker legacy. Thomas nodded, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the autumn chill. "The best in the county, they're saying." Jenkins' fields failed again. They both glanced toward the eastern boundary where Jenkins's farm lay, its fields brown and withered compared to their own abundant crops. Old man Jenkins had grown increasingly erratic since the equinox, raving about shadows in his barn and blood in his well. Do you think it's affecting him somehow? James asked quietly, nodding toward the shed, barely visible in the distance. Even bound, do you think it has influence? Thomas considered the question. Your grandfather believed it did. Said it fed on more than blood, on fear, on despair, on the dark thoughts that come unbidden in the night. Then we should check on Jenkins, James said with a firmness beyond his years, after the day's work. Thomas agreed, proud of his son's sense of responsibility. The boy had taken to the family's secret burden better than Thomas had expected, studying his grandfather's journal with serious dedication and asking thoughtful questions about the binding ritual. Unlike Thomas, who had been kept ignorant until inheritance forced knowledge upon him, James was being prepared properly. As the day waned and the hired hands departed, Thomas and James made their way to Jenkins's farm. The contrast between properties was stark, where the Williams farm bustled with harvest activity and well-maintained buildings. Jenkins' land had the neglected look of a place sliding into ruin. Fields lay partially harvested, with rotting corn still standing in some sections. The farmhouse windows were dark, despite the approaching evening. "Mr. Jenkins!" Thomas called as they approached the porch. No answer came. The front door stood slightly ajar. James glanced at his father, concern evident in his expression. Thomas nodded grimly and pushed the door open. The smell hit them first, a heavy, metallic odor that both men recognized instantly. Blood. The interior of Jenkins's home was dark, but enough late afternoon light filtered through the windows to reveal disarray, overturned furniture, broken dishes scattered across the floor. "Mr. Jenkins!" Thomas called again, his voice tight with apprehension. A shuffling sound came from the kitchen. Thomas motioned for James to stay behind him as they moved cautiously toward the noise. In the kitchen doorway, Thomas stopped abruptly. Jenkins sat at his kitchen table, a shotgun resting across his lap. Before him on the table lay something that made Thomas's blood run cold. A cat, slit from throat to belly, its blood collected in a ceramic bowl. "Jenkins," Thomas said carefully, "what have you done?" The old farmer looked up, his eyes fever-bright in a gaunt face. "It told me how to keep it away," he said, his voice a parched whisper. "Blood keeps it satisfied, keeps it from taking mine." James shifted behind his father. "What told you that, Mr. Jenkins?" Jenkins's gaze shifted to James, then back to Thomas. "The thing in your shed," he said simply. "The thing that walks in the spaces between sleep and waking. It comes to me every night now, Williams, whispering, hungry." Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "It's bound, Jenkins. It can't leave the shed." Jenkins gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Its body, maybe, but its voice, its thoughts." He tapped his temple with a blood-stained finger. "Those go where they please. You need to come with us," Thomas said, taking a step forward. "The Reverend can help you." "No!" Jenkins shouted, raising the shotgun. "You don't understand. It's chosen me, says I'm special, says I can help set it free." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Says your binding is weakening already." Thomas froze. "That's impossible." The equinox ritual was successful. Jenkins smiled, revealing teeth stained with something dark. "Is that what you think? It laughs about you, Williams, about how you think a few drops of blood and some mumbled words can hold it." He leaned forward. "It's ancient. It was here before your grandfather, before the settlers, before anyone. And it's patient." In one fluid motion, Jenkins raised the shotgun to his own chin. "Jenkins, no!" Thomas lunged forward, but the explosion of the gun threw him back. James cried out behind him as Jenkins slumped forward onto the table, the back of his head gone. For a long moment, neither Thomas nor James moved, shocked into stillness by the sudden violence. Then Thomas grabbed his son's arm. "We need to get back to the farm, now!" They ran most of the way home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields. As they approached their property, Thomas noticed something wrong immediately. The tool shed door stood open, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. "Did you check the binding this morning?" James gasped as they slowed. Thomas nodded, a cold dread settling in his stomach. It was secure. The cage was glowing strong. They approached the shed cautiously. Inside, everything appeared normal, tools hanging in their places, workbench neat and orderly. The soul cage sat where it always did, its brass fittings gleaming in the dying light, but the glow that had emanated from within was gone. The glass panels were dark. "No," Thomas whispered, reaching for the cage. "No, no, no." He unlatched the brass closures and opened the device. Empty. Whatever had been trapped inside was gone. "Pa," James said, his voice tight with fear. "If it's not here, where is it?" Thomas's mind raced. Jenkins had spoken, as if in direct communication with the creature, had even killed himself apparently at its behest. And if what Jenkins said was true, that the binding was already weakening, then perhaps the creature had been influencing events from within its prison, gathering strength until it could break free. "The house," Thomas said suddenly. "Your mother, the children." They sprinted across the yard toward the farmhouse, where lights blazed warmly in the windows. Thomas burst through the door, James right behind him. Margaret looked up from the stove where she was preparing dinner, startled by their violent entrance. "Thomas, what on earth—" "Where are the children?" Thomas demanded, scanning the kitchen. "The twins are upstairs. William went to the barn to fetch eggs for tomorrow's breakfast." She wiped her hands on her apron, concern creasing her brow. "Thomas, what's happened?" Before he could answer, a scream pierced the evening quiet, high and terrified, coming from the direction of the barn. "William!" Margaret gasped. Thomas grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace. "Stay here," he ordered Margaret, then turned to James. "Get the twins and keep them in the house. Bar the doors and windows." Without waiting for a response, Thomas ran toward the barn, heart pounding with fear for his youngest child. The structure loomed dark against the twilight sky, its large doors closed, despite the fact that William should have just entered. "William," Thomas called, approaching cautiously. "Son, are you in there?" A small, frightened voice answered from inside. "Pa, is that you?" "I'm here, Will. Are you hurt?" "There's something in here with me, Pa. Something bad." Thomas's grip tightened on the iron poker as he pulled one of the barn doors open. The interior was shadowed, lit only by the last rays of sunlight filtering through cracks in the walls. The familiar smells of hay and livestock filled the air, but underneath lurked something else, a scent of damp earth and decay. "Will, where are you?" Thomas called, stepping further into the barn. "Up here, Pa." The voice came from the hayloft. Thomas squinted upward, but could see little in the gloom. "Stay there. I'm coming up." He moved toward the ladder, keeping the poker ready. As he placed his foot on the first rung, a whisper came from behind him. "He tastes of fear, your youngest." Thomas whirled around. Standing in the shadows was a figure, human in shape, but wrong in every detail. It wore the tattered remains of clothes that might have been fashionable a century ago. Its face, barely visible in the dim light, bore a terrible familiarity. "Jenkins," Thomas whispered. The thing that wore Jenkins's face smiled, the expression stretching its features unnaturally. "Jenkins is gone, but his body serves well enough for now." It tilted its head, regarding Thomas with eyes that reflected no light. "Until I find a more suitable vessel." "Let my son go," Thomas said, raising the poker. "Your quarrel is with me." The creature laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "My quarrel is with all living things, farmer. Your blood, your children's blood, your livestock's blood. It all sustains me equally." It took a step closer. "But I admit a fondness for your bloodline. Your grandfather nearly destroyed me with his binding. Your father maintained it faithfully, and you—" It smiled again, revealing teeth too sharp for a human mouth. "You've already failed." "Pa?" William's frightened voice called again from the hayloft. "Who are you talking to?" "Stay where you are, Will," Thomas shouted, not taking his eyes off the creature. "The binding wasn't broken," he said to it. "You couldn't have escaped." The thing wearing Jenkins's body chuckled. "The old farmer was right. Parts of me could reach beyond the shed even while bound." whispers, suggestions, dreams. It gestured to itself, enough to convince poor Jenkins to provide the final sacrifice needed to weaken your binding beyond repair. His life, freely given, shattered your grandfather's cage. It took another step toward Thomas. Now I'll take your son, then your daughters, then your wife. I'll wear your skin back to town, perhaps. The Reverend might make a fitting next meal. Thomas lunged forward with the poker, driving it toward the creature's chest. With inhuman speed, it sidestepped, grabbing Thomas's wrist and twisting until he dropped the iron with a cry of pain. It flung him against the barn wall with terrifying strength. "Pa!" William screamed from above. The creature looked up toward the hayloft, its mouth stretching into that terrible smile again. "Don't worry, child. Your father will watch as I feed." And it moved toward the ladder, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if Jenkins' body was an ill-fitting suit it hadn't quite mastered. Thomas struggled to his feet, searching desperately for a weapon. His eyes fell on the lantern hanging by the barn door. "William!" he shouted. "Cover your face!" Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed the lantern and hurled it at the creature's back. Glass shattered, kerosene splashed, and flames erupted as the lamp's wick ignited the fuel. The creature shrieked as fire engulfed Jenkins's body, whirling around with inhuman speed. "Fire cannot destroy me, farmer," it howled, even as Jenkins's flesh blackened and cracked. "I will return." Thomas grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the wall and charged, driving the tines deep into the burning figure. The creature howled again, a sound no human throat could produce. It thrashed wildly, knocking over a stack of hay bales that immediately caught fire. "William!" Thomas shouted over the growing roar of flames. "The window! Jump to the stack outside!" The barn was catching fire rapidly, dry hay and aged wood providing ready fuel. Thomas backed away from the burning creature, which had fallen to its knees but continued to move. Jenkins' body little more than a charred shell now. A crash from outside signaled William's escape through the hayloft window. Thomas turned to flee, but the creature, still burning, lunged forward with impossible speed and grabbed his ankle. Thomas fell hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. "If I burn, you burn with me," the thing rasped, its voice barely recognizable as Jenkins's corpse blackened further. Thomas kicked desperately, trying to free himself from the creature's grip. The barn was fully ablaze now, flames climbing the walls and racing across the hayloft. Smoke filled the air, choking him as he struggled. "Pa!" William's voice came from outside, terrified and desperate. With a final mighty effort, Thomas drove his boot into what remained of Jenkins' face. The skull collapsed with a sickening crunch, and the grip on his ankle loosened enough for him to scramble away. He lunged for the barn door, pushing through it just as a section of the roof collapsed behind him. The night air, cool against his smoke-seared lungs, made him cough violently as he stumbled away from the inferno. William ran to him, throwing small arms around his waist. In the distance, Thomas could see James and Margaret rushing from the house, the twins close behind them. "Thomas!" Margaret cried as she reached him. "Dear God! Are you hurt?" Thomas couldn't speak, still coughing as James took his weight. Together they retreated to a safe distance as the barn became a roaring column of flame against the night sky. "The thing from the shed," Thomas finally managed to gasp. "It possessed Jenkins. It was in the barn." Margaret's face paled in the firelight. "Is it destroyed?" Thomas shook his head grimly. "I don't know. My father tried fire before. It didn't work then." They watched in silence as the barn burned, the structure gradually collapsing in on itself with tremendous crashes and showers of sparks. The livestock, thankfully, had been in the fields for grazing and were safely distant from the blaze. "What do we do now?" James asked, one arm still supporting his father, the other around a trembling William. Thomas stared into the flames, remembering his father's journal. There had been other attempts to destroy the creature before the binding. Fire, iron, even holy water from the church. None had succeeded completely. But perhaps there was another way. "We need to rebuild the binding," he said finally. "Stronger this time." "How?" Margaret asked. "If it escaped once." Thomas turned to look at his family, gathered close around him in the flickering light of their burning barn. In that moment, he understood something his father and grandfather had missed. "Not one bloodline," he said slowly. "A family binding, all of us together." Later that night, after the barn had burned to smoldering ruins and the family had retreated to the safety of the house, Thomas explained his plan. The original binding had relied on one man's blood, one man's will. But what if it drew strength from an entire family? What if the Williams bloodline united could create a binding the creature couldn't escape? Reverend Porter arrived just before midnight, summoned by the sight of flames visible from town. He listened gravely as Thomas recounted the night's events and proposed his new binding. "It's dangerous," the Reverend warned. "Such rituals aren't to be undertaken lightly." "We have no choice," Thomas replied. "It will come for us again, stronger next time. It knows us now. It will hunt us." As dawn approached, they made their preparations. Margaret mixed a paste of ash from the barn with clay from the creek and iron filings from Thomas's tool chest. The twins, solemn-faced and determined, helped prepare new iron charms under their father's guidance. James and Thomas constructed a new soul cage, larger than before, with glass panels taken from the farmhouse windows and brass fittings from the family's best candlesticks. William, pale but resolute, stood watch at each window in turn, searching the farm's perimeter for any sign of the creature. "It'll be drawn to us," Thomas explained, "to our blood, our fear. We won't need to hunt it." As the sun rose on the Williams farm, casting long shadows across the charred remains of the barn, the family gathered in the kitchen. The new soul cage sat on the table, surrounded by candles and the iron charms. "Are we certain it survived?" Margaret asked, voicing the hope they all shared but dared not embrace. Thomas looked at his youngest son. "William, what do you feel?" The boy had been unnaturally quiet since the barn fire, his usual curiosity subdued. Now he looked up at his father with eyes too old for his 10 years. "It's watching us," he said simply. "I can feel it, like eyes in the dark." Thomas nodded grimly. He had suspected as much. The creature had formed a connection with his son in the barn, just as it had with Jenkins before. But unlike Jenkins, William had a family to protect him. "Then we begin," Thomas said. Reverend Porter opened the family Bible and began to read passages selected carefully from Thomas's father's journal, words of binding and banishment in languages older than the settlement of Iowa. As he read, Thomas took a small knife and made a shallow cut across his palm. The blood welled dark against his skin. "For protection," he said, letting several drops fall onto the soul cage. Margaret stepped forward next, her face resolute as she took the knife and made a similar cut. "For hearth and home," she whispered, adding her blood to the binding. James, solemn beyond his years, was next. "For legacy," he said as his blood joined his parents'. The twins, holding hands for courage, stepped forward together. "For sisterhood," they said in unison, their blood mingling on the brass. Finally, William approached, his small face set in determination despite his fear. "For memory," he said in a clear voice, as Thomas helped him make a tiny cut on his thumb. His blood, bright red in the morning light, completed the circle on the soul cage. As the last drop fell, a sudden wind swept through the kitchen, extinguishing all but one candle. The family drew closer together, William's blood united against the darkness. "It comes," Reverend Porter warned, his voice tight. The temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming on the windows despite the autumn morning outside. A shadow gathered in the corner of the kitchen, darker than the absence of light, moving with purpose. "Williams," came a voice like dead leaves rustling. "Did you think your fire could destroy me?" The shadow coalesced, taking form, no longer Jenkins, but something else. It appeared as a man dressed in the style of the earliest settlers, but its proportions were wrong, its movements too fluid, its eyes pools of darkness in a face like yellowed parchment. "I was here before your kind built homes on this soil," it said, regarding each family member in turn. I fed on the native tribes, on the first settlers, on the lost and the forgotten. It smiled, revealing teeth like needles. And now I'll feed on you. Now, Reverend, Thomas shouted. Reverend Porter raised the Bible and began the final words of the binding ritual, his voice strong despite his fear. The creature hissed, taking a step toward them, but seemed unable to move closer. The single remaining candle flared suddenly, its light reflecting off the glass panels of the soul cage in complex geometric patterns that filled the room. "No!" the creature shrieked, its form becoming less substantial as the light touched it. "Not again!" "Together," Thomas told his family, placing his hand on the soul cage. Margaret laid her hand over his, then James, the twins, and finally William. "We bind you," they said together, their voices joining in a single declaration. "By our blood, by our will, by our name, we bind you, creature of darkness, to this cage and to this land." The creature howled, a sound of rage and hunger and ancient malevolence. It lunged toward them, but where it touched the light reflecting from the soul cage, its form sizzled and smoked. The patterns of light seemed to wrap around it, constraining, compressing, pulling it inexorably toward the brass and glass construction on the table. "This will not hold me forever," it raged as its form elongated, stretched like taffy being pulled into the soul cage. "Your children's children will forget. The binding will weaken. I am patience incarnate." "Perhaps," Thomas acknowledged, his family standing firm beside him. "But for now you are bound by William's blood, and William's blood remembers." With a final shriek that rattled the windows, the creature collapsed inward upon itself, drawn fully into the soul cage. Thomas quickly closed the brass latches, sealing it inside. The glass panels glowed with an inner light, brighter and steadier than the previous binding had ever achieved. Silence fell in the kitchen, broken only by the family's ragged breathing. Reverend Porter closed the Bible, his hands trembling slightly. "Is it done?" Margaret asked softly. Thomas looked at the glowing soul cage. "For now, but we must be vigilant. Each equinox, each solstice, we renew the binding, all of us together, and we'll find a way to destroy it permanently," James added, his young face set with determination. Thomas nodded, though in his heart he wondered if such a thing were possible. The creature was ancient, perhaps as old as the land itself, but they had bound it more strongly than ever before. The Williams family, united, had proven stronger than William's blood alone. In the days that followed, they rebuilt the barn with the help of neighbors who attributed the fire to a knocked-over lantern. The soul cage was secured in a specially constructed vault beneath the new structure, surrounded by iron and salt and protective symbols taken from his father's journal. Each family member kept a small iron charm with them always, a reminder of their shared burden and responsibility. As autumn deepened into winter, Thomas often found himself standing at the edge of his fields, looking toward Jenkins's abandoned farm. The land would be sold at auction soon, new settlers would come, and life would continue. But beneath the rhythms of planting and harvest, beneath the cycles of seasons and generations, the Williams family now carried a secret knowledge. That darkness lurked in the spaces between their carefully tended fields, held at bay only by their vigilance and unity. On cold nights, when wind whispered through the corn and shadows seemed to move with purpose across moonlit fields, Thomas would gather his family close around the hearth. Together they would read from his father's journal, ensuring that the knowledge was preserved, that the ritual was remembered, that William's blood remained strong against the ancient hunger that waited, bound but not destroyed, beneath their Iowa soil. For they were farmers, the Williams family, and what they harvested each year was not just corn and wheat and livestock, but safety, paid for in drops of blood and eternal vigilance, crop after crop, generation after generation, for as long as their name endured on the land. And in its prison of brass and glass the creature waited, for it too was a harvester of sorts, and it was patient.